Great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk today. I know many of you on the call today have heard my voice many times, probably too many times, talking about the New York State Invasive Species Database, and always encouraging people to enter their data into IMAP Invasive. But today I'm going to talk about a different project that we've been working on that certainly leverages all that information that we've been gathering over the years on invasive species locations and distributions, and many of these discussions that we've had at a statewide level. And so there's been so many efforts across the state, of course, with the PRISMs and through the state agencies to work towards protecting the state from invasive species. And many of these conversations over the years have been, how do we be strategic about invasive species, both surveying and management? And so over the last couple of years, we've formalized these discussions with help through the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. Carrie brought a lot of us together to try to put down on paper pretty much what it is that we're using to prioritize and how could we develop tools to help us be more strategic in using our resources for invasive species management and control and surveying and so forth. And one of the themes that kept popping up is that invasive species prioritization happens in many different ways. And depending on the goals of your organization or your land organization and so forth, you might be looking at the area of infestation, what species are there, and what particular projects do you have at hand. And in many cases, it's a combination of all these different ways of prioritizing. Sometimes you're limited to just a specific species or location. And this tool that I'm going to talk about today is really focusing in on the areas and how you prioritize locations for invasive species. So take a moment and think about your organization or your invasive species efforts and how do you prioritize the work that you do. Are you focusing, say, on protected areas, whether these are state lands, maybe state parks, areas with high conservation values? Maybe your organization focuses on recreation, which can certainly be impacted by invasive species. There could be lots of high-risk areas in your region that could be the source of invasives that you want to pinpoint. And of course, there's always areas that are not heavily invaded. Even though we get kind of daunted sometimes by seeing invasives almost everywhere, there are still lots of areas within the state that are not heavily invaded. And so those warrant a lot of consideration as well. And so those are a lot of different factors to consider. And a few years ago, the state of New Hampshire took a stab at trying to create some type of prioritization map that took into account many of those factors. And they developed a heat map for the state that essentially the darker areas are areas where invasive species management will both prevent new invasion spread and protect areas that are critically sensitive and have high conservation value. And so when this came out, a lot of folks here in New York State were very excited about this project and wanted to see how we could make something similar or at least, inspired by this New Hampshire product, but specifically for New York State. And so with the New York National Heritage Program, we decided to take on this task last year and see if we could take a stab at creating something for New York State, at least the first cut that we could start getting feedback on. And the Natural Heritage Program is really set up well to provide data and information resources for conservation, specifically focusing on rare species and protecting natural ecosystems. And so this is also where the IMAP Invasive and Invasive Species Database program is housed. And this is one of the mapping resources that the Heritage Program has created over the years. So we thought this would be a good intersection to tap into a lot of the spatial data expertise that the Heritage Program had and a lot of this invasive species information that we've been gathering. And we wanted to first identify, okay, so what are we trying to get out of some type of spatial prioritization tool for the state? There could be many different ways to approach this question. So what we have pinpointed here with this project is a way to help natural resource managers prioritize where to focus resources for early detection surveys and invasive species control by highlighting biodiversity values and where high-value natural areas are susceptible to new invasions and dispersals. And to do this, we brought in lots of existing GIS or mapping information that influence invasive species control decisions. So we explored the components of the New Hampshire map and looked at a lot of the information that they were pulling in that they had for their state, and we tuned it to New York. We had goals to maintain a high resolution so that you could zoom in to a specific park and still have useful information. And we wanted to leverage the extra data that we have here in New York State. And so with all this, we wanted to create a new synthesis layer, combining all this information on certain themes that we feel influence the invasive species control decisions. And so by creating this, and I'll try to keep repeating this theme, this model that we're creating, the values and such need to be driven by the users and the expected uses of it. And so I feel like this will continually be a work in progress as we get more feedback and more inputs that we can put into the model. But what I'm presenting here today is this first start, first cut at what we could use at a statewide level. And so a basic overview of our approach, and I'll go into each of these in more detail here in a moment, was layering up themes of information that we have data on at a statewide level. So ecological significance was our baseline theme for the model that we created, and this includes biodiversity metrics and also habitat quality. And then we were able to list certain parts of that model with protection status and also land cover of certain areas. So if something had a very high biodiverse metric, then that could also be lifted even more so in the model by having some type of protection status, like maybe it's a state park or some type of state forest. And then we also included in this spread vectors and insertion points. So this is essentially the risk of spread, which is mapped out by human stressors. And then on top of these data layers that we use to create the model, then we incorporate the invasive species locations that we have. And so to go into these piece by piece, we'll start with the ecological significance. So much of the value within the model that we've created comes from the information that the Natural Heritage Program has been accumulating over decades on rare species locations, significant natural communities, and element distribution models, which are the predicted habitats for rare species. We also incorporated stream health metrics from the DEC Stream Biomonitoring Unit and predicted native mussel richness as another indicator of stream health. And so by combining all these different data layers, we were able to create a ecological significance thematic map that we would use to put into the final model. And so for the next part, the listing component, which was protected or natural areas, we heavily relied on the New York Protected Areas database. So this is the database that has been created for the state by the Natural Heritage Program to aggregate all the parcels across the state that are under some type of conservation protection. So whether it's a county park or a state park, the goal is to have that included in this database. And the original formation of this database came from Rick Heinel looking through tax parcels and the different codes that are given at a statewide level. And so these different parcels that have some type of conservation protection are then further listed by what we call the Biodiversity Index score, created by the Natural Heritage Program. And this is a way to just kind of split out parcels that have a lot of ecological significance versus those that do not. And then in addition to protection status, we also included natural cover as coded by the National Land Cover Database, and I believe this is a USGS product and is available statewide and nationwide. And so we combine those to create the thematic layer for protected or natural areas. And then we also included the risk of spread. And to create this layer, we use, first of all, a layer created by the Natural Heritage Program earlier called the Landscape Condition Assessment. And this includes lots of different human stressors, the transportation network, urban and industrial development, utility corridors, land use and land cover as well. And there's also an element included in this LCA layer that calculates the anticipated size of the stressor or impact of the stressor and the distance away from the stressor that impact would lessen. So if you have something that's like I-90 running across the state, it's going to have a much higher impact, and that impact is going to be felt at a further distance away from I-90 than, say, a gravel road that is cutting through a state forest land. And we also included recreation use of natural areas. And so we gather data from the New York State DEC databases on boat launches, campgrounds, and trailheads. And then combined all those to create a thematic map of risk of spread. And so each of those thematic maps that we created are composed of the different data layers that I discussed, and they were assigned different weights based on discussions with our work group. We've had a work group help us make these decisions along the way. And so this information is available if you are interested in getting all the details on what layers were added, and also we have links to the ones of these. Most of these are publicly available, so if you have ArcGIS, you could download these data layers as well and work with those. And we took each of those thematic layers, so the ecological significance, the protected or natural areas, and the risk of spread, and combined those to create what we're calling the comprehensive score. So that yellow and orange map that you're seeing on the bottom, this is indicating, the hotspots on those are those high areas, indicate areas of high conservation value with a high risk of new invasions and dispersal. And you can see from those percentages that are up there, the ecological significance is the heaviest driver of the scores that are, or the areas that are popping out on that final comprehensive score map. And you might be wondering, okay, so what about the invasive species location data? Because we did not include that in the actual analysis to create the comprehensive map. But this is where you can start using the maps that we created to overlay that with the invasive species data so that you can make decisions based on where those hotspots are and where you have invasive species observations that are corresponding with those areas. And we want to be able to use these maps at many different scales. You know, and thinking about the statewide areas or statewide scale, how could we use something like this to help us make decisions? And I can see maybe the state agencies being able to use the statewide map. One example that I thought of, and so I'm going to keep throwing out different examples along the way, just to start people thinking about how they might be able to use this. You know, I could see New York State DOT using a map like this so that they can look at the major roads that are, and I guess also the smaller roads as well, running through the state so that they can start to prioritize the resources that they might have for invasive species control to be able to maximize conservation values. So on the comprehensive score map, those hotspots are, you know, the highest conservation value and also where those are intersecting with human stressors. I think in many cases, people would be looking at more of a regional scale and using these maps for those purposes. And so thinking about more of the PRISM level. And so where can our PRISM efforts target high-value natural areas that are prone to new invasions and dispersal? So we're hoping that these maps will help with strategic planning, and making decisions at the PRISM level with your PRISM partners to help think about your upcoming field season or long-term planning as well. And then we also want these resources to be valuable at the site level as well. So zooming in even further, I've zoomed into Hampshire State Park here in the Capital Mohawk region and overlaid that, these little dots that you might see on there, the black dots are the invasive species observations that we have. And so we want park managers or reserve managers to be able to use this as well and pinpoint areas within their parcels that they can focus their resources on. And so one example I thought of for parks might be, say you get a call that a big crew of volunteers are coming tomorrow and they really want to do some invasive species work. So how can you quickly and easily pinpoint some areas that are easily accessible, so maybe along roads or trailheads or trails, and would also have a high conservation benefit if you did an invasive plant removal project. And so in that case, you might look at the map for your park and determine where those hotspots are on the comprehensive map so that you could find those areas. And so coming back to that map or the slide that we had a little bit ago, we combined all these different themes to make this comprehensive score map. But as we started talking to the work groups, we realized that that final product, that comprehensive score, isn't the only way that people are needing to look to, or the only thing that people need to look to answer questions for the goals of their preserve or their organization. And in many cases, the questions that they were trying to get answers to for spatial prioritization came from these other component maps, so either the ecological significance, the protected or natural, or the risk of spread. So that feedback was really valuable and made us realize that we also need to have these component maps accessible and being able to overlay the information with those would help people make other decisions for their invasive species efforts. So one example of using, say, the ecological significance map plus the IMAP invasives data that you might have is if you solely want to focus on areas of highest conservation value in your parks. And so regardless of where the human stresses are, if you wanted to focus on those highest areas of conservation value, you would only use then the ecological significance components of the map. Another example for these component maps would be using that risk of spread map. Say if you had an early detection species pop up, such as stiltgrass, Japanese stiltgrass, in many places upstate New York, it's still considered early detection, and it's easily spread along human corridors. And so you could use the risk of spread map along with the data that you have for Japanese stiltgrass to then try to figure out where you should focus your surveys to see where those are popping up next. And in some places in the state, you also want to prioritize areas that are, high conservation value, but are further away from road corridors. So that comprehensive score map was lighting up areas that were closer to human stressors, but say like in the Adirondacks, you want to focus on areas that are further away from those corridors, then you can work on overlaying the ecological significance with the risk of spread and visualizing areas that have those high ecological significance components but are further away from the human corridors, and those could be the areas that you want to focus your early detection efforts on. And so with these maps that we've created, one of the main things we want people to do is be able to get to them and start looking at them and, giving us feedback on it. So we've made these accessible within IMAP invasives as raster layers. You do need an IMAP invasives account, a level 4 or up. And so if you need an account or you need an upgrade in order to see the maps, just go to our website and there's a request a login tab there, so you can fill that in and we'll get you set up to the proper account level so that you can see the maps. And we also have the map layers available as ArcGIS files or as TIFF files openable in ArcGIS. And you can email the IMAP Invasive email box, and we'll send you a link to download those files. And this is what it looks like in IMAP Invasives right now. So if you log in and you go to the map area, and then on the left-hand side, there's the table of contents with all the different map layers. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, then you'll see the new model analysis layers there. And I've turned on the comprehensive score, so you can see the yellow and red heat map that pops up there. One thing I do recommend, since all these layers are very data intensive, is to change out of the satellite imagery base layer. So you can change the base layer to like Google Streets or Open Street Map. You can even take out the base map altogether to just have a blank base map. So that might help with the loading speed and so forth. And you can toggle back and forth between the different components that make up the comprehensive score. So this is the risk of spread map. And then you can see those little arrows next to the layer names. Those arrows will move the layers up and down, so that this is helpful if you're trying to set up a map to print off or to put into a presentation. So you can put one layer on top of the other and vice versa. And then that little I button next to those arrows gives you more information about the layer itself, and it also has a transparency slider. And so that'll be helpful once again if you're trying to set up the map for the best visual display depending on what it is you're trying to show. And of course, you can load up the invasive species information onto the map. Here up in the search box, you can type in your species name, and that will load up the known observations that we have. And then you can start zooming in. And so we have, here I have the hemlock lily belgid loaded up, and I'm zooming into the Finger Lakes area. And as you zoom in more, you can get to that site level scale to really help you with prioritization in your park or your preserve. And so we've been trying to get as much stakeholder feedback on these maps as we can as we've been going along the way. And we've had a work group that's been helping us out a lot, and also getting feedback from, whoever wants to take a look at the maps and, get that expert eye, because this is a model, of course, and so it's kind of a snapshot of our values at one point in time. And so, and of course, it's also, determined by the inputs that we've put into the model. So as new information becomes available, as different data sets are updated, then this map will continuously be a work in progress. And so I'm asking anyone who is interested in taking a look at those maps to, help us answer some of these questions. Essentially, do those hotspots of that comprehensive score map correspond to the areas that you think should be highlighted in your region? And also the same thing for those ecological significance maps. Are those highlighted where you think that they should be? Because it really takes, I think, that local expertise, those folks who know a certain region the best, to help us determine how accurate these maps really are. And we're looking for examples of ways that your organization or your region could use these maps. So thinking more of those use case examples. And one thing that has come up quite a bit in the feedback is that certain parcels of land are missing from the protected or natural cover component of the analysis, and of course that affects the overall comprehensive score map. And so if you find that parcels are not lighting up that do have some type of protection status, so maybe a town park is missing or a county park, then we need to get that information submitted to the New York Protected Areas database, because that's where we're pulling this information from. And you can submit missing parcel information to NIPAD.org. And if you do that by the end of December, then we'll be sure to include that in the next iteration of this map. So just we'll, push for folks to go ahead and look at these maps so that we can get that updated information in there. And so we hope to, or we plan to continue to solicit expert review of these models. We've been tapping into our work group, presented at the CCE in-service earlier this month. And, of course, we want the PRISM partners to take a look at these and help us determine what seems to be working with the maps and what's not working. Of course, create more examples of how to use these maps. We plan to rerun the current analysis with new parcel data that's submitted to NIPAD. And we're also considering a separate analysis for aquatic systems. And this is another key piece of feedback that we've been getting from people who have reviewed the maps, that even though the maps seem to be working out well for terrestrial systems, when you start focusing in on the lakes, it's not working out well. And the model itself is heavily driven by the biodiversity information. And so, and of course, the rare species and natural communities information that we have here at the Heritage Program. And so that's not corresponding well to what the experts are thinking should be cited as high quality for aquatic systems. So we're going to be looking into finding other metrics that we can include for aquatics and see how we can better improve our analysis on the aquatic end. And that map to the side there, that's one example of the Finger Lakes. The Cayuga Lake really lights up on these heat maps, but the other surrounding Finger Lakes do not. And so that's something that the Finger Lakes group at the in-service pointed out to me, and it's something that we definitely want to work on. And further down the road, some other ways that we can use these maps or improve upon these maps, we would love to have some type of user-driven interactive modeling tool. Since the values that we input into this tool, like I said, represent one snapshot of our values at one given time, it would be even more powerful to the user to be able to weight all those different variables according to their goals, their conservation goals, so that they can make decisions for their parks and parcels and regions and so forth. It would be great to create some species-specific model inputs. So these maps so far are generalized. They are not species-specific, but we could perhaps fine-tune these on a species-by-species basis, as we have that information available. And it would also be great to incorporate some of the climate change models that are available. I know that CNC put together a climate resilience or nature resiliency mapping, looking at climate change factors, and so something like that would be wonderful to incorporate into this. And with that, I want to thank the folks who have been working really hard on this. Amy Conley is the spatial ecologist at the Heritage Program, and she was the brain power behind a lot of these maps and putting those together. And Tim Howard and Brent Keinel offered a lot of input along the way. And then our work group, made up of many people who are on this call and key stakeholders and invasive species efforts across the state, have been instrumental in providing feedback as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for the time here and take any questions or feedback that you might have.